Welcome to your first video lecture. So in this video we're going to be focusing on the Second Industrial Revolution. We're going to be briefly talking about some of the major inventions in the late 1800s and the early 1900s, but we're going to be focusing in a lot more on the Transcontinental Railroad and Henry Ford and the automobile. So toward the end of the Civil War and the years after, a lot of different inventions were popping up. Here you can see a list of a few different inventions like the typewriter, the telephone, the phonograph. These were all things that revolutionized society. We're going to be focusing on these kind of inventions a lot more when you guys come in tomorrow into class, so I'm just going to jump right into the Transcontinental Railroad. Two of the early problems that railroads had was the fact that the South didn't actually have railroads that formed the network. You had railroad lines that just went from point A to point B, but they didn't actually connect in the way that the North connected. The tracks in the South were also different sizes, different widths, so if they wanted to connect Southern railroads to Northern railroads, they actually couldn't because the train cars couldn't actually drive on both of the railroads. So in order to adapt and to fix this problem, the Southern railroads decided that they were going to match the North. Now, if you look at the map that's right in front of you, you can see that there are a lot more Northern railroad lines than there are Southern railroad lines. So it was a lot easier for the South to adapt than for the North. Once a standard size was developed for the railroads, the railroad lines boomed. They grew exponentially. So you guys can actually see that top picture that's on your left are the railroad lines in 1890 versus the railroads that existed in 1918. I mean, the industry itself just boomed. Once the railroad industry boomed, it created thousands of jobs. You needed a lot of people to actually build all of these railroad lines and to connect these networks in the North and in the South. So it gave a lot of people a lot of jobs. Not only that, it was a lot easier for you to travel out west. So it opened up the country, the rest of the country, to settlement and to growth. The railroad industry was also racing to lay tracks to actually supply miners in the mines out west a little more easily than what was readily available. If you're looking at the map directly in front of you, you can see that all those yellow dots are the different mines that people were working in, and you can see exactly how many railroad tracks actually go that far out west. So the idea of a transcontinental railroad, a railroad that goes from the east to the west, was developed in order to make supplies more easily available to miners. So in order to build this transcontinental railroad, you actually had two companies that were starting on opposite ends, and they were going to meet in the middle. So you had the Central Pacific Railroad that was actually starting out in California, and then you had the Union Pacific Railroad that was starting out in Nebraska. The meeting point would have been in Utah, and you can see just how far they actually had to lay the tracks and where that meeting point is on the map. In order to actually build this transcontinental railroad, you obviously need workers. Now, this was dangerous work. You had to go through mountains. It was cold. It wasn't something that a lot of people actually wanted to do. So the Union Pacific Company hired a lot of Irish immigrants versus the Central Pacific Company that hired a lot of Chinese immigrants. Almost 90% of their workforce were in fact Chinese, and they were heavily discriminated against. Here in this picture, you can actually see some of the Chinese railroad workers working in the middle of the snow. They had to work through deserts, blast through the mountains. It was a difficult job, and they were not paid very well, and in fact, a lot of them actually died performing these duties. In addition to the Transcontinental Railroad and the railroad lines booming, you also had the boom of the automobile. Now, the earliest cars actually traveled between 18 and 20 miles, so they were pretty slow. But in the very beginning, they were only affordable for the wealthy Americans. Henry Ford developed the Ford Model T, which became the most popular car in America because it was both cheap and reliable. So since the Ford Model T was now cheap, it opened the door for other Americans buying vehicles, not just wealthy Americans. Since the Ford Model T was so cheap and reliable, other Americans besides the wealthy Americans started to purchase it. The reason why they were able to purchase this vehicle was because Henry Ford had developed the assembly line. Now, the assembly line is when you have one person that does the same job all day long. So if your job is to actually put on the front right wheel, then you put on the front right wheel all day long. And the person next to you would then put on the back right wheel, and they would do that all day long. This reduced the production costs, and it also made the assembly of the car a lot quicker. Ford's Model T vehicle was assembled in just 93 minutes, so they were coming out of the factory very quickly. Working on the assembly line was mindless. It wasn't something that required you to use your brain other than to know what your specific job was. So it made it difficult for Ford to actually keep employees. In an effort to attract employees to his company, he decided that he was going to double the average daily salary to just $5 a day. That was big bucks back then. As cars were becoming cheaper and more reliable to own, obviously it increased in popularity, which caused a lot of traffic. You now have trolleys, horses, people, and cars all in the same streets. So the need for traffic regulations became evident, and this is when you have the development of all the traffic laws that you are familiar with today. During the 1920s, the US government decided they were actually going to build more roads, including highways, many of the highways that you are actually familiar with. Now, if you take a look at this picture, this was considered a highway. Basically, it looks like a muddy road. So in order to facilitate traffic, in order to facilitate people's lives with cars now, the US government was going to invest on actually building and maintaining these roads. Now, the Ford company was also the only automobile factory that was willing to hire black workers. This was huge. You can see here in an ad, it makes Ford appear as though he is a understanding, tolerant man. He is for the African Americans, but in fact, they were actually given the worst jobs in his factories, and they were never truly equal to their white counterpart working for Ford. Ford was also very anti-Semitic, meaning that he did not like Jews. It was very well known that he didn't like Jews, and he would use his money to actually publish things against the Jews, as the two newspapers that you could actually see here. When the car actually became popular in the US, people thought that the car was too labor intensive for women and that they would not actually be able to handle the car. It wasn't until the invention of the turnkey ignition that cars were deemed suitable and acceptable for women to drive. While Ford's Model T car was immensely popular, he believes that people only care about cheap, reliable cars. It was just the basic of the cars, nothing else was added. This actually causes him to lose business because you have the development of General Motors. Now, General Motors caters to flashier cars, to more comfortable cars, and to cars that could be bought on credit. So General Motors was beginning to appeal more to the wealthier class because Henry Ford's car was just so simple, so cheap, and just so basic. So you have reached the end of your first video. We've covered the Transcontinental Railroad, and we've covered Henry Ford and the automobile in depth. These are questions that you should be able to answer with the notes that you have written down. You do not need to write down the answer to these questions, but the answers should be in your notes. If they are not, go back, rewatch the video, and make sure you actually have the answers to these questions. Don't forget about your blog, so make sure you head over there and you answer the question that's there in your blog. And don't forget about your review and summary part of your notes as well. I am looking forward to seeing you guys tomorrow in class.